Okay, so what's the alternative to synchronic theories of phonology where infants have some elaborate system of grammatical constraints or some way of producing elaborate systems of grammatical constraints in order to shape the output patterns of their eventual language they'll acquire? What's the alternative to that? Well, here's one. And so while that approach using constraints in learning and induction and synchrony that we saw in the last section is sometimes referred to as substantive bias. So, right, children have constraints with substance in them that say, I have a grammatical constraint, don't have this thing followed by this thing. That's the substance of the constraint. That's sometimes contrasted with what's referred to as channel bias. This is also sometimes called evolutionary phonology, and this is a very different idea. Here, the force that shapes the output patterns in languages is not so much any grammar that's existing inside an infant's head at any given moment in time, but instead it's the process of getting a language from generation 1 over to generation 2. This channel, right, is not a clear, straightforward channel. It's a channel that has speech production and speech perception introducing all kinds of bias. And that's what shapes linguistic systems. This is the idea of evolutionary phonology. So what's the basic outline here? Well, children don't learn anything about the markedness or non-markedness of any sequences in this approach. There's no such thing as markedness constraints. That's not a part of a child's synchronic grammar. All they need to learn here is the lexicon of their language. Right? So adult saying dog, child needs to learn dog and what a dog is, presumably. Learning these lexical items just by themselves is inevitably going to be shaped by perception, right? Because we know that the sequence of sounds duh, og, guh is not inherent to the furry four-legged animal. It's an arbitrary pairing of sound and meaning. So obviously infants are going to need to learn that. And the only way they can really learn that is by hearing the word said, and this channel from adult to infant, or from whatever speakers an infant is hearing over the infant, this is a biased, noisy channel. Right? So things that are hard to perceive, or that are very variable because of articulatory difficulty, are likely to be misheard or inconsistently produced, or both, in the primary linguistic data that these infants get from the previous generation. That could result in a child learning the wrong word, with scare quotes here. It's just not the same word that the adult was trying to produce. Right? As this is associated with John O'Halla, and it's sometimes referred to as the innocent misapprehension theory. Right? So the idea is that the adult's trying to produce one thing, it comes out funny because of the dynamics of articulation, acoustics, and perception. And so the child misapprehends that, not through anybody's fault, but just because that's how the channel of language transmission works. Right? As these innocent misapprehensions multiply over time, they shape a language's lexicon. And then later, when linguists look at all the words that occur in this language or that language, they'll find all of these patterns in the lexicon. But that's not because of anything constraint that's inside the infant's brain or their mind. It's just because of the externalities of transmitting language from one generation to the next. For instance, for this she and she example that we keep coming back to, how would this work? Well, let's say the adult has some C sequences in their language and some she sequences in their language, and they're speaking words either to the child or in the presence of the child, and the child is acquiring those words. These are going to come out, and presumably the she is going to sound like she, but the C maybe is going to sound, again, a little bit palatalized, a little bit more like she than you might want it to, just because of the way that speech production works with co-articulation. So these are going to come out, they're going in the infant's ear, and maybe the infant keeps these distinct and learns this contrast, but maybe the infant hears both of them as she. So we're now in the infant's ear. And if this is how this works, then the infant's going to only come up with lexical items that have she in them, and will now have lost this underlying representation in the process of moving from this generation to this generation. So this is just one word. In order for this to completely shape the lexicon of the language over time, you need to lose maybe a couple hundred words or something like that. But given that, languages exist for many generations and there's all sorts of opportunities for errors and mislearning, over time, maybe all of the C words in your entire language, every word with this sequence of sounds in it, is eventually going to get misheard as a she word, and you'll end up with this grammar or this lexicon instead of the original lexicon. There's no markedness constraints at all here. All the child is doing is listening and positing or memorizing lexical items in their lexicon based on what they've heard. There's some chance every time this sequence occurs that it's going to be misheard as this. But there's very, very little chance that this sequence is going to be misheard as C, because there's nothing about the production of this that makes it sound more so-like. There's nothing about speech perception that would cause you to hear this as being very so-like. And so this particular pattern of mishearing is very, very unlikely to arise. And it's certainly not going to arise over and over again throughout the entire language, whereas this one is fairly plausible, right? And this could arise over and over again. So in the end, you can imagine pretty easily how a language that has both C and she sequences could eventually turn into a language that has only she and no C. It's extremely hard to imagine, on the other hand, how a language with both of these could turn into a language with only C sequences. That would be pretty weird. You'd need a series of unlikely possibilities. So what does that mean? We don't find these kind of anti-Korean type patterns where sa and sha contrast, but only sa occurs before e. The reason we don't find those patterns in natural language typology is because there is no sequence of natural phonological processes that would result in a pattern like that, as compared to this roughly Korean-like pattern where there is a sequence of natural phonological processes that result in this pattern becoming this one. That's the basic idea of evolutionary phonology, or channel bias. Right? And this is taken to be a diachronic approach to typology, or diachronic approach to phonology, where diachronic means across points in time, as opposed to synchronic, which is at a particular point in time, because in this theory, individual speakers at individual moments in time need not know anything about perception or articulation or markedness or phonetics at all. All they need to do is memorize some words, speak in a particular way, hear things in particular ways, and repeat what they've heard or memorize what they've heard. Right? That's all you need to do here. You don't need any special markedness constraints, re-ranking, grammars, or anything like that. You basically just hear words and memorize them. Right? And the actual changes, the shifts in the grammar, and the generalizations about which sequences are marked and unmarked, these come from the process of transmitting languages over time, across points in time, diachronically, because this process can converge on some patterns, right, but not on others. Right? That's the basic idea. So now that we have all of these different theories of how typological patterns in phonology might arise, how are we going to decide between them? Well, part of the answer here is that it's very hard. So it's very hard to tease apart the predictions of this kind of channel bias approach and the phonetically grounded alternatives where people have phonetically based grammars. This is in fact one of the big open questions in contemporary phonology. People still argue about this a lot. Here's the problem. In the general case, any perceptual or articulatory pressure that we can formulate as a synchronic constraint, like star C, because there's a co-articulation mismatch between these two segments, or because the interiority feature is hard to hear in this context, right? That's where those grounded markedness constraints are coming from. And anytime we can formalize one of those pressures as a markedness constraint, then it's also something that could affect the transmission of languages, right? If it's hard to hear this distinction, then that could have consequences for language learning. Right? If it's hard to produce this distinction, then that could have consequences for language learning. So in the general case, any phonetically sensible markedness constraint that you can write is going to correspond to something that could affect the process of language transmission, and that makes it very hard to tell the difference between the two kinds of approaches. So for this semester, wrapping up, I just wanted to note that both these approaches exist. It's worth keeping in mind. We're going to focus mainly on synchronic phonology next semester, just as we have this semester, but I did want you to be aware of this. And then finally, at the end of next semester, we're going to hear a little bit about some arguments that might help distinguish between these two approaches. But for now, I just wanted you to know that these theories exist.